Good morning, everybody. Welcome here today. I just want to acknowledge some of you might be having some tech issues and jumping on. We're expecting quite significant numbers, so hopefully you'll be able to join us at some time. We're up to the hundreds now, so we're doing very well. So welcome this morning. I'll begin. My name is Deb Sabaris. I'm the CEO of the Centre for Excellence. I will begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting. I'm here on Wurundjeri land of the Kulin Nation. I'd like to acknowledge elders past and present, elders from other cultures and emerging Aboriginal leadership, and that this is and always will be Aboriginal land. So today's webinar is part of the Tri-Peaks project, which is a collaboration between the Centre for Excellence in Child and Family Welfare, the Victorian Healthcare Association and the Victoria Alcohol and Drug Association to support integrated practice and good governance across our three sectors. I want to give a shout out to Tom Simonson and Sam Biondo, the other two CEOs that are part of this initiative, and thank them for their incredible work, and that this initiative couldn't have come at a better time. It's drawn lots of praise and also been incredibly useful during the COVID period and beyond. For our first webinar in 2021, I'm very pleased to welcome back Tom Craven, Director at Cube Group. Tom delivered a Tri-Peak webinar in June 2020, The Journey from Response to Recovery from COVID-19 to Victoria's Community Health and Human Services sector. Tom's webinar 8 months ago considered the multiple waves of COVID-19 and was incredibly well received. Today we will hear from Tom about where we're at in the waves of COVID-19 and gain a deeper understanding of children and families who are experiencing vulnerability due to COVID-19 for the first time or for the first time in a long time. So what I might do is get Oliver to just go back to the housekeeping slide for me. Thank you very much, Oliver. So just to remind everybody, this is a Zoom webinar, so please use the chat and Q&A functions for your questions and comments, and you will indeed have them. Hopefully we'll get some time. Tom's presentations are usually so interesting. We like to take our time with the presentation. At the end, if we have time, we will also have a Q&A session. The slides from today's session and the recording will also be shared following this webinar and be available on the Centre's VHA and VADA's websites. Now I'll introduce Tom for you. Tom is an economist and strategy consultant with Cube Group. Cube is a purpose-driven consultancy working solely with public value organisations across government and non-government sectors. Tom's work focuses on the delivery of public services. He helps health, justice, education and social service organisations to understand the major economic, social and policy trends impacting their business and to chart a course through them. Prior to consulting, Tom held senior leadership positions in the Department of Human Services, Premier and Cabinet and Health. We're always grateful to have Tom back. He's done a lot of work with the Centre over the last year, and I'm going to hand over to Tom so that he can run us through his presentation. Thank you so much for being with us, Tom.
Thanks very much, Deb, and I really appreciate that welcome and particularly being welcome back. Can I also start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that each of us are on and pay my respects to elders past, present and future. And thanks to each of you for sharing your lunch breaks, hopefully with me. It's a pleasure to be back. I must say it is a little bit daunting, even feels a bit cruel to have someone who spoke about a year played out that way. We are in unprecedented times, so I was quite nervous in dusting off my slides for this presentation. Who said, of course, it's better to be broadly right than precisely wrong. So hopefully some of what I had to say.
Now we're having some problems with Tom and the stability of the network. I did suggest that we were having some problems today. Now, Tom, how are you going there? You're just dropping it out a little bit.
I do apologise.
That's
Hi,
okay.
am I back?
You're back. We might persist.
I'm terribly sorry, everyone. I'll try again, and I just warmed myself up into full flight, so I'll go back to the very beginning. Bear with me. Let's hope that was a one-off. Let's hope that's a one-off. Let's see how we go. Let me start with just a reminder of what we spoke about last time I was here about a year ago, and hopefully some of this has rung true. Our message about a year ago was, as the COVID-19 pandemic was at its peak, and all of us, many of us, were busy responding to the crisis that was. I think our view was to try and raise our eyes a little bit and look at not just the first wave that all of us were dealing with, and that all of you, I'm sure, have been dealing with for the past year, responding to that immediate crisis, both the health crisis itself, but also maintaining your essential services and businesses during a period of physical distancing. We also wanted to raise on people's consciousness the idea of multiple waves that this pandemic would cause. The second of which I'm sure many of you are deeply embedded in at the moment, a backlog of services that had to be delayed or otherwise downscaled during a social distancing period. Some of you in the health sector are no doubt are feeling this acutely, but it's of course not just true in the health sector, but of course other sectors represented in here that had to scale down their services significantly and are now facing really unprecedented backlogs of services. What I was hoping to talk to you today is provide an update on where we are in relation primarily to the second two of those waves. Firstly, an increasing complexity of patients or clients due to our inability to intervene early or to engage in preventative activities during the social distancing period. A marker of a good service system is its ability to intervene early, and we were, of course, prevented from doing that for a significant period of time due to the need to physically distance. So increasing complexity of our clients and our people's experiences is part of that. And then, of course, the fourth one there, the long-term economic and social impacts from what has been an unprecedented disruption to economic and social life. For your sectors, of course, I don't need to tell you that there is a strong connection between social and economic well-being and the types of issues and challenges in which you engage in people's lives. It's well documented, the links between social and economic status and health outcomes in relation to child well-being, in relation to drug and alcohol usage, and many of the other overlapping challenges that your sectors work with. So what I want to do today is provide you a bit of an update of where the economic impact of the pandemic is, and a bit of a view about what might come forward, and then I might conclude with what I think some of the implications are for your sectors. I do promise to do my absolute very best to keep to time. I'd love to have a period of time for questioning if I can manage to do that. So where are we now? Where are we now, particularly in relation to that fourth wave, the long-term economic impact of this pandemic? And just a reminder from a couple of the points I made about recessions and economic downturns last year, we in Australia, very fortunately, have not had all that much recent experience in relation to recessions. A couple of things I said last year that I think are proving true. Firstly, that all indications are that this is a historic recession and of a scale that we've not seen, certainly in my working life and many others around. The other key points, though, about recessions is they do take a long period of time to recover, particularly in relation to employment. It takes even longer than a bounce back in overall economic activity. Recessions are also not neutral. They don't spring back to normal, to the same. They change the shape of the economy. They impact different people and different sectors differently, and that has a long-term impact that does not return to normal. And finally, recessions tend to exacerbate and extend underlying trends or vulnerabilities, and we'll see some of that as I work through where we're up to today. So let's start at the start, and some of you will have heard our Treasurer recently speaking very positively about the state of the recovering economy. And of course, if you look at those two little green sticks there on the right end of the left diagram, that diagram is quarterly change in GDP. The last 2 quarters have had positive improvement in GDP of greater than 3%, and that's in real terms. Our Treasurer was keen to point out that 2 consecutive quarters of greater than 3% economic growth is something that's not happened in this country for something like 30 years. And of course, if you just look at those 2 sticks there, that is of course correct. That is a significant and positive rebounding. On the right-hand side, I've compared our economic performance. This is comparing where we are today to where we are a year ago. Well, excuse me, where we are in the December quarter to where we were a year ago. Australia is doing comparatively much better than a lot of our peers, particularly our cousins in Europe in particular. You'll see China's a positive performance there as well, but China's been a high-growing economy for a number of years. 6% for them is a significant decline in their rapid growth rates. So comparatively speaking, Australia's rebound is looking pretty quick, particularly relative to other countries around the world and historical performance from us. However, we don't just look at those last two sticks, and when we take a broader view and we take a step back, or a wider lens, if you like, it remains the case that 2020 was a historic economic contraction of the likes of which most of us have never seen in our working life. What you see here is the annual change in economic output for the year, and you'll see that in the last year, while today we're only around 1.1% from where we were behind where we were a year ago, over the entirety of the year, the Australian economy contracted by around 2.6%. And compared to anything that we've experienced in modern records, going all the way back to 1960, you'll see that that is by far the largest drop and by far the worst economic performance that we've had in that period. You can see Australia's two recessions in there that look like little blips. The 1990s recession, which was, of course, devastating for many people, and of course the recession of the 1980s as well. The one we're currently experiencing dwarfs all of those. And of course, we can barely see the global financial crisis. It's in there around 2008. Growth fell below 2%, but still looks extremely positive compared to what we're experiencing today. 2020 was the largest drop in GDP on modern records. In any other context, it would have been a disaster. And I think what I want to talk you through at the moment is that actually for many people and many families, 2020 absolutely is a disaster from an economic perspective as well as from a health perspective. This graph potentially shows a bit more clearly what overall economic performance looks like. Now, this is Australia's economic output by quarter, and as you can see, the significant drop there during the height of the pandemic, and an impressive V-shaped looking rebound. Today, our economy is about 1.1%. In the fourth quarter, it was 1.1% lower than it was a year ago. However, we have a growing economy, particularly due to increasing population. And so in order to sustain a sort of reasonable trend of the last 10 years, actually we're about 3.6% below what we were a year ago. The overall scale of that cost is enormous. It's somewhere in the order of, depending on how you estimate it, somewhere between $50 and $100 billion, or somewhere between 2 and 4% of GDP. It's an extraordinary economic downturn of which, as you can see, we're still yet to recover. I mentioned earlier that employment tends to recover more slowly than economic activity, and that is, of course, proving to be the case here as well. On the left-hand side, you'll see all the squiggles representing unemployment. I'm actually going to pause here, but I meant to say this earlier at the start. Please, I think this is said in the chat, but I'll make all these slides available to you after the session. So please don't feel the need to scribble down or take photos or anything like that. Please have your lunch break, sit back, relax, enjoy a tour through lots of graphs, and you'll have all of these available to you afterwards. So please don't worry about us rushing through. I'll go through them at a reasonable pace. On the left-hand side there, you'll see rates of unemployment that shot up quickly during the height of the pandemic, and that are still essentially at the levels that they were at the worst of the pandemic. The composition has changed a little bit, but today unemployment levels in Victoria are about 2 points higher than the average was prior to the pandemic, and that represents something on the order of an extra 100,000 Victorians out of work. When you look at the graph on the right-hand side, which is the absolute number of Victorians out of work, you'll see that any improvement in the unemployment rate comes from people leaving employment. That's it, giving up on the job market. Because in terms of overall unemployed people, there's been almost no improvement over the course of the pandemic. Like I said, something in the order of 100,000 Victorians out of work, somewhere in the order of 250,000 Victorians out of work, 100,000 more than the level prior to the pandemic. Just to put that in context for you, Work for Victoria, a very positive initiative from the Victorian government that's been immensely successful. It's created something in the order of about 10,000 jobs, which is an extremely positive achievement, but just goes to show the size of the challenge and really that there is no substitute for a strong market economy in terms of producing a number of jobs to keep people employed. Of course, unemployment is only part of the story, and this graph tells the other part of the story, which is what you might call underemployment. On the left-hand side, there's a graph there of monthly hours worked, which has been growing steadily in Victoria over the last 20 years or more. Part of that is population growth, but it's also growth in employment and working hours. As you can see there, it is still well and truly much lower than it was prior to the pandemic. There's been some sort of recovery, but it's still around 5% lower than it was a year ago. That last little blip there is the month of January. I'm going to take that as us all needing a really well overdue holiday. So I think that is just a blip, and that improvement will continue. But nevertheless, we're still talking somewhere in the order of 5% below where we were a year ago. On the right-hand side, you'll see changes in overall employment levels, and that's where, of course, things get slightly interesting and slightly different to other recessions. Ordinarily, if you had a drop in 5%, you had a 5% drop in monthly hours worked, you'd expect to see the equivalent of that in terms of people's employment. You'd expect to see businesses that couldn't sustain employing workers at that level of hours, and you'd expect to see a drop in employment by that amount. But as you can see, there's on the right-hand side, there's a more interesting story than that. And you'll also see the first of a series of divergences that I want to draw your attention to that go to our story about how this crisis is impacting people differently. You will see in the sort of lighter green colour for part-time employees, employment for part-time employees fell sharply and is still thereabouts 5% below the level it was prior to the pandemic. So the level of hours worked is consistent there. For those on part-time employment, employment fell swiftly and is still significantly below what it was prior to the pandemic. The interesting story is the darker line there, which is full-time employment. Full-time employment fell nowhere near as much as part-time employment and has managed to recover to almost the level it was prior to the pandemic. That's a little bit of an anomaly in an overall sense, but there's one really clear and obvious reason for that, and that is, of course, JobKeeper. JobKeeper has sustained a level of employment that would certainly have been nothing like that during this pandemic without it. At its peak, JobKeeper covered around 3.5 million employees. That's something like a quarter of Australia's workforce. I think the Reserve Bank estimated recently that without JobKeeper, around 700,000 people more would have lost their jobs. JobKeeper has been remarkably successful in sustaining employment during this extraordinary period. But of course, it won't last forever. And in fact, Commonwealth Government has made very clear that JobKeeper is due to finish this month and has made very strong messages that it will finish this month. For me, that raises the most important question looking forward. Given the information I've just shown you, are we seeing an economy that's in recovery? Or are we, if you'll forgive a very crude cliche and misuse of medical terms, are we seeing an economy that's in recovery, or are we seeing one that is in fact on life support? With at risk of being a dismal scientist as an economist, I'm going to put forward quite a few reasons to suggest that actually while the economic recovery we're seeing is positive, there are many reasons to suspect that actually it's heavily reliant on some sort of economic life support. Let me talk you through what that is, and my conclusion will be that we're about to see significantly more economic and employment pain as the federal government begins to unwind such a significant program of JobKeeper. The first reason to suggest that our economy's recovery is not as strong as you might think is simply to point out, firstly, almost all of that growth and that recovery is coming from government investment. So over the course of 2020, government spending was the only positive contributor to overall economic performance. For those of you who are not familiar with the national accounts, the imports and exports at the bookends of this graph are a little bit tricky to understand. Basically, imports detract from GDP. They're work and value created elsewhere that we import in. So when you see a positive contribution to GDP from imports, that means imports have fallen over the period. So a positive contribution of imports to GDP growth is actually not a sign of health, it's a sign of weakness. It means that we're importing much less than we previously had. In this case, undoubtedly, it's because of reduced economic activity. The flip side of that is at the other bookend, where, as you can see, exports have fallen almost 3% over the course of the year. Outside of those two pillars, the only positive contribution to economic growth has been government spending. I've got some short stats there on the right-hand side about just the scale of government investment in stimulus investment. Many of us will remember the very positive and successful stimulus package of the global financial crisis. The COVID-19 response is continuing to dwarf that make that seem almost nothing. So estimates from KPMG put it at about $507 billion that the Commonwealth Government is investing in stimulus expenditure. And according to the GDP growth figures, that is responsible for almost all of the contribution to growth over the past year. The second reason to think that our economy is less stable and more under support, more supported than we might think, is this information here. This is analysis we've done using information on average hours works and the number of employees in the sector. The number of employees across the economy. It is the other side of the coin to the previous graph I showed you, where there was a divergence between part-time and full-time employees. So if you remember, full-time employment has fallen much less than part-time employment, and the level of full-time employment in the economy is about the same as it was prior to the pandemic. But when we imply the actual hours worked by employees, you'll see that the average hours worked by employees has declined enormously over the period of the pandemic and still to today. Now, again, that last spot on that line is January. I'm going to take that as a well-earned holiday for all of us. But nevertheless, before then, we're still talking an order of magnitude of 5 or 6% average hours worked by a full-time employee below the pre-pandemic average. It is my strong suspicion that that is due to the ongoing support of JobKeeper that's enabling many jobs that would be unsustainable without that payment to continue. Melbourne Uni estimate that JobKeeper is currently supporting somewhere in the order of 250,000 employees. That's somewhere in the order of about 2% of all Australian employees that continue to be supported by JobKeeper, which, as I mentioned earlier, is scheduled to finish up this month. On the part-time employee front, as you'll see, the story is the other side of the coin. The average hours worked by part-time employees has recovered in full and is now well above the level prior to the pandemic. A third reason for thinking that our economy is not as strong as the recovery might suggest is this indicator, which is a very commonly used lead indicator. So this is job advertisements using data from Seek. For those of you who follow this information, you'll know that job advertisements are a common lead indicator of economic activity. They fall more quickly when the economy is falling, and they bounce back more quickly when it's bouncing back. As you can see there on the left-hand side, comparing Victoria with Australia on the whole and New South Wales, you'll see that job advertisements did indeed fall significantly and quickly during the pandemic as expected, and are still recovering, not yet to the point that they were prior to the pandemic. On the right-hand side, you'll see the anomalous situation, the positive situation, if you like, created by JobKeeper, which is that while job advertisements fell more quickly at the start of the economic contraction, they haven't recovered anywhere near as quickly as job numbers have themselves. Job numbers overall have sustained, and this is on back at the level that they were prior to the pandemic, when job advertisements are still well behind. That's my strong suspicion that this suggests that private job advertisements have not rebounded to the level they would to sustain an ordinary level of employment. And probably last, and perhaps my last view as to why I think there is still significant economic fragility that may be exposed through ending of JobKeeper is this from businesses themselves. So this is information gathered by the Australian Bureau of Statistics. It shows businesses themselves reporting whether revenue from their business has decreased, whether it's stayed the same, or whether it's increased over the previous month. And this shows the second half of last year through to February. As you'll see, only a very small number of businesses are reporting an increase in revenue from their previous month. In the most recent month, there's only 1 in 6. Significant numbers of businesses continue to report ongoing decreases in their revenue, and the vast majority of businesses report a business revenue that is either staying the same or falling on previous months. So in the most recent quarter, that was around 80%. For me, that does not suggest an economy that is rebounding swiftly. That suggests an economy that's sustained by underlying temporary investment from government. Let's talk. I want to talk a little bit about that investment in government because it provides a bit more of the context about where we're headed next. So I mentioned earlier the level of investment from government in stimulus is significant, dwarfing that of the global financial crisis. excuse me. Australian government in particular has invested at levels that are far greater than, well, equal to and greater than most other developed countries. As you can see from the graph below, our investments are on par with other economies, including those that have been more severely hit by the pandemic than ours, particularly the United Kingdom. But all this funding comes from somewhere, and particularly this is a graph that I'd like to stick in your mind as to something to plan for over the coming couple of years. On the left-hand side, you've seen the way that the Commonwealth Government is funding this stimulus, and that is through, of course, increasing government debt. The left-hand side shows that the little bar charts is the absolute value of that debt, reaching up close to $1 trillion in the out years. The line there is that amount of net debt as a proportion of overall GDP. Some of you may recall shortly after the global financial crisis, conversation about rising net debt in relation to that stimulus. If I can try and find the dot that represents 2008 on there, as you can see, net debt is at a level that no longer seems relevant given where we are today. Debt levels had been steadily increasing, as you can see, prior to this, but the response to COVID-19 is resulting in a step change in government debt to levels that we haven't seen, again, within modern records back to prior to the 1970s. I think a step change is the right way to think about this. We have, as a nation, had a conversation about national debt, but we have never really had the level of debt constraints that some of our overseas peers have had and experienced, particularly during the global financial crisis. Our levels of debt have always been moderately low. In my view, we're about to enter a long-term period following this recovery of significantly constrained government by having a level of public debt far beyond something we've experienced for quite some time. On the right-hand side, I've got level of government debt by selected state governments. And as you can see, the trend is similar. Victoria is there in the pink of most relevant to our conversation. A significant growth in state debt as well, but New South Wales and to a lesser extent Queensland are also significantly increasing their levels of public debt to support stimulus activity. Close to home, a bit more detail on the Victorian government experience. As you can see, expenditure rising rapidly as part of their COVID-19 response, leading to, over on the right-hand side, yes, historic levels of net debt for the Victorian government. I think this raises, like I said earlier, particularly a long-term consciousness for government about levels of constraint around public finances that we haven't really had a conversation about for quite some time. Some of you may remember the budget period leading into the before COVID-19 hit, and particularly some of the revenue challenges the Victorian government was facing. Some of you would remember the experience of fiscal cliffs, if you like, lapsing significant investments or other investments that were at risk as governments tried to repair their overall position. Looking at that pink line on the left, there is already built in a fiscal cliff of sorts as well, a significant reduction in long-term expenditure. What I think this means for us is that we also need to throw on top of this some significant investment commitments that governments are making. I have, of course, just released the Royal Commission into Victoria's mental health system. There are Royal Commissions at the Commonwealth level in relation to aged care, of course, and disability services. The Family Violence Royal Commission was not so long ago as well. We also have a major infrastructure program, one of the biggest in our history, and a range of other spending commitments from an aging population and other demographic factors. What I think this means for us is entering into, beyond the response, a long period of sustained and constrained government dealing with high levels of debt, far beyond what we've experienced previously. Having given you that whistle-stop tour, I want to shift gears a little bit. I've given you hopefully an overall picture of where we are in relation to the economy, but I'm particularly conscious that the overall story can mask the underneath story. I believe last time I spoke to you, I shared with you my favourite meme of the pandemic so far. I think in the second half, this might have been my favourite meme. Whether or not you may not know of it, Babylon Bee is a satirical website, and this was a a bit like The Onion or one of those. This was an article they produced during the middle, celebrities spelling out we're all in this together in their yachts. Of course, pointing out something that many others have pointed out lately, that we're all in this together. Our experience of this is by no means all the same. In fact, I've really appreciated the recent conversation about saying we are all in the same storm, but we're not all in the same boat. I think that's a really important observation. And so while in many ways some of the economic recovery is quite encouraging, there are, of course, significant groups in our community that I want to draw your attention to who are not being projected by these temporary measures in the way that others are. I think it's important for us to be very careful, those of us who are in fortunate positions to have weathered this crisis well, to not use our proverbial relatively comfortable votes to think that we all got through this together, when in fact many members of our community struggled in a significant way. Probably the most significant of those is young people, and I want to spend just a little bit of time on some of the data in relation to young people. Young people are bearing the overwhelming economic burden of this downturn. If you have a look on the left-hand side with comparing the unemployment rates for young people versus all members of our economy, as you can see, there are significantly higher rates of unemployment that rose swiftly during the economic downturn and haven't returned. At current, that's something like 88,000 young people out of work. And as you see over to the left-hand side, as where we are today, young people make up almost 90% of the jobs that were lost comparing where we are today to where we are a year ago. Almost 90% of those jobs were for people under the age of 25. Others on this call will know much more than me the impact of difficulty in finding work and opportunities for young people who are leaving school or leaving other forms of education. Difficulties in entering the workforce can have long-lasting effects on people's skill development, on their suitability for the workforce and their long-term economic futures. Young people are facing one of the most uncertain economic periods of time for young people that we have in memory. Again, far beyond periods that we're worried about, such as coming out of the global financial crisis. And we do need to throw onto this, I think, also the observation that young people were at least at risk from the virus itself. Young people were, as we all know, much less susceptible to the virus, but yet they are bearing an overwhelming burden of this economic downturn. They also, on current trajectories, will be the ones whose income will pay off that debt burden that I spoke about earlier. The second group that I want to draw to your attention is something that I became aware of at the midpoint of the crisis. During the pandemic itself, there was an interesting economic news around that actually average weekly earnings for individuals was rising. Now, average weekly earnings is for those people who are employed, how much they take home every week. And during the middle of the pandemic, average weekly earnings rose by almost 4%, which is almost unheard of in the data. Today, take-home earnings by employees is still almost is something like 2% higher than it was prior to the pandemic. And if you're a full-time employee, that's almost 3% higher compared to prior to the pandemic, which is a very strange thing to happen in a significant economic downturn. We don't fully know why that is, but I think the most plausible explanation is data that I've got from Indeed Employment, an employment organisation, which suggests that job losses have particularly been concentrated at the lower end of income. So the graph you'll see on the right-hand side, those on higher incomes, something above 1,700 a week, which is the average weekly earnings for Australia. Comparing December 2020 to a year ago, employment in that higher wage bracket is up by 4.1%. Whereas compared to medium and low income worker, employment is down by 2% for the medium and 3.2% at the lower end. Now, this is consistent with what I mentioned earlier about part-time employment, of course. It's also consistent with some of the sectors that we'll talk about in a minute. But it leads to a really damaging outcome for those of us who care about inclusion and economic well-being, that actually the jobs that have been lost in our economy are focused on those already at the lower end of the income scale. It's a similar story in relation to businesses. So this is data that's gathered by the ABS in relation to weekly payroll information, and shows the changes in employment by businesses of different sizes. As you can see very clearly, businesses at the small to medium end, those with under 20 employees or under 200 employees, have experienced much larger reductions in employment than larger organisations. The most simple explanation for this is, one, the sectors that have been impacted, which I'll speak to in a second, but also that JobKeeper, of course, covers one of a business's main costs, its wages, but doesn't cover overheads and other costs associated with a business. And small businesses are much less ready to be able to absorb those costs. So these results seem entirely predictable, and small to medium businesses make up an enormous part of our economy. So something like 45% of employees work for a small business, and it makes up something like 90% of our businesses. The next group I wanted to, of course, make you aware of is the different sectors of our economy. I think this is well known to just about everyone, but it's worth focusing on. We have talked in the past about having two-speed economies in Australia during, for example, the mining boom. We really do have very different speed economies in relation to the impact of the pandemic. Many of you, of course, will know of the challenges in the accommodation and food sector. Employment in those sectors is still down by more than 12%. At the other end of the scale, many of the sectors represented on this call, I'm sure, in relation to health and social care, or in relation to government, those of us who are close to or part of public services and public governments, we've seen a significant growth in employment and much more secure funding. Those businesses in education space as well, many of you know of the challenges of higher education due to the border closures. Other sectors there as well, even construction activity, notwithstanding the significant government investment. It's worth again reminding you that this data predates the end of JobKeeper. So again, it is my view that that the end of that program will demonstrate significant vulnerabilities that are still there, possibly exacerbating these impacts. And of course, those who have been most let down by our temporary measures are those for whom the temporary measures have ceased. I suspect on this call I don't need to labour this point, and maybe I'll just refer you to the Grattan Institute's analysis on in relation to the removal of the COVID-19 supplement from unemployment benefits. I'm only repeating their words here, and they'll say it better than mine, so I commend their analysis of it to you. As you can see on the graph there, that the Grattan Institute has pulled together the COVID-19 supplement to unemployment benefits, what we call job seeker now, was an extremely positive thing for people on unemployment benefits, and for the first time in a very long time lifted that unemployment benefit above either of our common measures of poverty. Of course, that COVID-19 supplement has discontinued. It was replaced by an increase in the underlying rate of about $25 a week, which represents about a 10% increase on that payment. To our collective shame, that is the most significant real increase in 30 years, as you can see from that flat red line there of successive governments over many years having next to no increase in real terms in that unemployment benefit. That it leads, according to the analysis of Grattan Institute, it leads to that level of payment still being something like $130 a week below the relative poverty line. It's worth pointing out that that's occurring at a time when it is, of course, extremely difficult to find a job. We all know that, but there's some data here to demonstrate it. What you're looking at here is, again, data collected by the ABS on the median duration of job searching. It's a very cyclical data set, as you can see from the waves. It's better to be looking for a job in the middle to late in the year than it is at the start. But nevertheless, there's a very clear trend there in an increasing level of time it takes people to search and to find jobs, an average time increase of about 6 weeks. That, of course, makes the level of job seeker all the more important to people's livelihoods. It also creates its own underlying challenges. Many of you on this call will know of that longer term and more entrenched unemployment does significant damage to people's long-term harm and their ability to obtain subsequent employment. Those people who are out of work for a long period of time are much less likely to re-engage with workforce than those for only a short period of time. So this is a concerning trend in its own right. but also a concerning trend given the previous slide. I'm conscious of time and wanting to give a few moments of trying to be a man of my word and give you time for a couple of questions. I did want to leave you with just a couple of thoughts of where to go from here. I've hopefully outlined for you the state of that fourth wave, where I think our economy is up to and where it's headed. I'll summarise that in a second, but I also wanted to leave you with just a couple of observations from me, from what I've seen from some of your colleagues in your sector, ways in which your organisations have taken this sort of challenge and gone forward with you. And let me just give you a couple of thoughts for you to either ask questions about or to discuss amongst yourself. Perhaps one of the most significant shifts I think that this analysis can lead for your sectors is a reframing of what your sectors are in relation to Australia's economy, and particularly a reframing away from health and social services being a user of economic growth to a driver of economic growth. So this is analysis here that just demonstrates the contribution of the health and social services sector to Australia's economy. You are a significant component of the economy. You're a significant driver of economic growth. But most importantly, for my analysis, is that the health and social care is a driver of economic development and growth through significant employment. Jobs and employment in the health and social care sector are highly skilled and productive jobs. And in this environment, they're an opportunity to drive economic growth. They're not just a use of economic growth. They're not just a cause of government debts, but they're an opportunity to drive economic well-being and to drive well-paying jobs and economic growth to help us recover alongside doing the critical work in relation to those other waves that I mentioned at the start. The second reframing I want to suggest to you is this one here, is that a reframing away from government expenditure to public investment. I mentioned we're about to enter an era over the coming years of a more constrained government expenditure than what we've experienced for a very long time. I think there's an example here of some of the evidence, particularly coming from the at-home care and child and family services sector, of the ways in which your sector represent investments in the long-term well-being of, and particularly in long-term financial well-being of government spending, the ways in which your sectors can invest today to significantly reduce long-term government expenditure that can reframe particularly early intervention services, but particularly those with strong evidence bases, to be a source of investment, not just expenditure, recognising that long-term constraint on government spending. And finally, my third just thought of ways in which this analysis can help you frame is that moving away from a focus on crises in the tertiary system, which is of course a very real, but towards filling the missing middle. This is a theme that was pointed to quite clearly in the Royal Commission into Victoria's mental health system. But as I think I said to you last time, I think it has great resonance across many of your sectors. And I see an opportunity in this current significant fiscal investment from government to not only invest in the crisis hit systems, but to be also to invest in those missing parts that contribute to significant improvement to our service systems and long-term benefits from early intervention. So let me summarise and then pause for questions and discussion for our last 10 minutes or so. This has, in fact, despite the recovery so far, has been the most significant economic contraction since the Great Depression. It may be very much a relief to us and to governments that we are rebounding more quickly than many of our peers or than what we might have feared. But it is still an economic disaster of a scale that we haven't experienced for a very, very long time. Temporary government measures are absolutely delaying some of the impact of that, but they end soon. And in my view, there is more economic challenge and contraction, particularly in relation to employment, to come as government unwinds the JobKeeper program. I want to draw your attention to several groups in particular that are in the same storm as many of others, but not in the same boats. Particularly young people who must be a priority for us in the recovery, who have borne the most significant burden during this economic contraction. I've listed the others there and spoke to them earlier. The message is that these temporary expenditures have been very costly and they will constrain government for years to come. But there is, in my view, an opportunity for you and your sectors to help be a part of the economic problem, as well as the recovery, as well as the service delivery problem, as well as recovering from the health and social damage, to also be part of the economic solution. Deb, I'll pause there and we have a couple of minutes for questions.
Oh, Tom, that was incredible. Nothing like an applied economist's lens of what's going on, and to be able to take us from the first presentation to the second presentation has been phenomenal. There's lots of really positive comments in the chat. We've got a few questions, so I might go to the ones that are in the Q&A and start with. Now, this is obviously an ask about more data. So Michelle Crawford says, many thanks, Tom, great update. Appreciate you highlighting the impact on young people and their participation in the labour market, and just the data was startling actually, and in many ways not a surprise, just getting worse. Are you able to provide more detail on locational data or projected sectors for labour market growth? Now, we haven't asked Tom to do that, but yes, I'm assuming it can be done.
it can be done. Yeah, why don't I pop I certainly don't have that answer to hand, but why don't I pop a little technical appendix in the slides, and I'd be happy to provide some more information on that. There is a little bit. There's certainly regional variations, both within and across states. There's certainly more significant regional challenges. So I'd be happy to whack that in the appendix in the slides. It's probably the easiest way to do that.
That would be fantastic, Tom. And this is another one. I mean, you did talk about our sectors being a driver of economic growth, not just not just sucking resources out of the system. And this is a comment and a question really. It's been a phenomenal presentation. Do you have an opinion about why the health and social service sector is already seen by government as a driver of economic growth, when in fact it is? So it's that whole thing about how do we have that conversation? How do we make that shift?
Oh, I think that's an excellent question. I must say, I mean, maybe I'm a glass half full person. I think particularly some of the appreciation of the way that which Victoria is leading the world in healthcare, as an example, the success of some of our both high quality services and innovation has put on government's radar. I know that was part of the statewide plan a few years ago to really focus on medical developments and technology, commercialising those as a driver of economic growth. So I thought that was an appreciation that is a highly skilled and innovative sector. I think probably what I was hoping to possibly add with that analysis is just the way in which that your sectors are creators of high quality jobs, of well-skilled people, providing really valuable services. I think that's an element that's probably missed in the narrative a bit. The focus is perhaps too much on the, say, commercialisation of medical technology, whereas actually in child and family services, in drug and alcohol services, and in healthcare, you're actually creating both engaging vocations, but also highly skilled, highly productive jobs. So I think that's the way I'd like to see the narrative change.
Yeah, it's fantastic. A couple of other questions. So this is from Lyndon. Is there a gender analysis of the impact of the downturn?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that.
Great
because
question.
I've actually spent all day umming of how to do it. I shied away from it mostly because the information is quite mixed. So particularly, I think I mentioned in relation to unemployment early on, there was a very clear gender impact. Unemployment rates, hours worked, as well as just what we know about the sectors that we impact most. There was very clearly a gendered impact. More recently, some of that data has come back a little bit. I think I just showed you the overall employment levels and overall unemployment rate. Female workforce participation's come back up again as well. So in relation to the data, it's a bit mixed. However, I'm also particularly conscious in relation to talking about gender and other issues. This is one area where aggregate data can be really weak and can cover over many different stories. So it's the data we have is often very much at a one sector level. Education, for example, the experience of teachers, for example, working through completely different and moving very quickly is very different to, say, the experience of higher education, which is dealing with a lack of international students, those sort of things. So I didn't want to make any definitive conclusions because the data we have is so aggregate it covers over what's more significant.
Yeah, it papers over some of these things, doesn't it? Now we've got
I
three
think
more.
that's right.
We've got three more questions.
I would say the Grattan Institute has done some significant work on this. If you are interested, I know if you want to check out their website, I know they've done some of that. Some of that data has moved a little bit more recently, but I think their underlying observations are still absolutely valid.
Yeah. So Karen's question. What do you think the future looks like for the university sector? This is crucial for young people. And again, excellent presentation. Look, we know that, I mean, we don't know numerically, but we know things are pretty bad for the university sector. What are your thoughts on that, Tom?
Yeah, I couldn't correct you, to be honest. I can't, from my limited knowledge of the sector, I can't see a really positive period for them until the borders open again. I think our higher education system is a really excellent source of exports, and it's really well respected around the world, and that's why we have so many international students that are so important to them. I think possibly there's an opportunity in that in terms of reorganising the way that we organise our higher education system to provide more of the skills that we need locally, but that's much more complex than I am confident enough to speak on. I think, for what it's worth, I can't change your view, Deb. I think it's going to be a very difficult period of time for higher education until we have the borders open.
Yeah. We've got a few. I'm going to jump around on these now. So one on tax cuts. I mean, everybody's asking you everything, Tom. This is from Sam Biondo. Should tax cuts be seen as a plus to drive economic activity, or as a negative, as contributing to continued long-term debt by reducing the tax take? Very typical Sam Biondo question.
Good on you, Sam. Now, yeah, look, fun question that I'd love to spend much more time on. I don't think it's quite as simple as that. I think there are multiple ways in which governments tax, and some of them are more positive than others. I mentioned a little bit about young people and the experience with them. I think we do need an honest conversation about the intergenerational impact of this experience. Young people experience the brunt of what had to happen to keep us safe. And are wearing the significant amount of that burden for the benefit of our community as a whole, which is a really positive thing, but it's something we need to take seriously. I think the one thing that hasn't declined all that much during this period has been obviously house prices, which are much more likely to be in the hands of older people. So I think from my end, I am worried about overall tax cuts. I do think we need to care about debt over the long term. I don't think that means income tax or immediate taxes, but it does raise some of those issues that are perennially around, like the way we tax superannuation and the way we deal with assets. Others have spoken much more than me about those things, but I would like to see new ways of reconsidering the way that we do taxing of property and assets, and taxing of superannuation as a way of paying for the significant costs, so that the young people who've already borne the cost of it aren't bearing the cost of it in the future either.
Now I'm going to do two more questions, and it will mean that the ones that we don't answer, we will definitely get Tom to help us answer them offline. So we'll go with the one from the top. Great presentation, Tom. What effects do you think the potential transition to more people working from home will have on the post-COVID economy? And I can say, Edie, really, I mean, in the centre of Melbourne, it's really problematic. And you know, we really don't have that many people returning to work in the middle of Melbourne. I mean, it's not busy, but it's concerning. So I mean, it's definitely had an impact. What are your comments about that?
Yeah, great topics. Gee, I feel like
I know.
If in a happier world we could all sit around and have a couple of drinks together and talk about all this. I'd love that. Well, a couple of thoughts. I think at the macro level, I don't think we're about to see the death of cities. I think cities are still great places to live and work, and I think they provide us the things that we like. So I still expect there is a bit of a trend of people moving away to the country, but I still expect that Melbourne will still be a very attractive place for people to live. So at that sort of macro level, I'm not expecting I reckon there's a bit of tree changing going on. That's great, but I'm still expecting Melbourne to be thriving. I think when I mentioned earlier on, recessions, they exacerbate underlying trends, and I think and they don't bounce back to normal. So what I think is very possible, I won't pretend to know the answer. What I think is very possible is we do see a move slightly away from the real CBD centric of Melbourne and towards more neighbourhood style communities with more people working from home, more people, whether it's full time or whether it's a couple of days a week or whatever. There's also a real possibility for growth in remote working locations, shared offices, those sorts of things. On a aggregate level, I find that a really exciting possibility for Melbourne, and I think there's a lot of positives about that. But there is, like I said, it's an economic trend that will mean cost for people, and I think that's a real risk. Yeah, so I can't see the same CBD being back to normal too soon, and I think there's possibly some longer term changes around more localism within an urban environment.
Thank you, Tom. We do have this interesting last question that, I'm a competitive creature. One of the questions talks about, in terms of the world economy, how do you think Australia will fare in terms of overall recovery compared to the sort of the US, the UK and Europe? Have you got a sort of a sense from all the data that we're tracking okay and we'll probably recover more quickly, or that it'll be a more chronic situation for Australia?
I think it's a really good question. I don't want to over promise whether I know the answer to it. So let me just maybe give some thoughts. I think there's a very different experience to go through a 5 to 6 month lockdown period, which, as intense as it was for Victoria, was sort of a 5 to 6 month lockdown period and then come out of it, versus the UK's experience of coming up to a year now and then to continue on beyond that. It is quite a different experience. Once something has been sort of shut down for a year, you really start to question a lot of things about it. You start to have events or occurrences that haven't happened now for 2 years, and so does that happen in the third year? Or that long-term tripping, I think that does significant damage. I mentioned JobKeeper certainly covers a significant expense for businesses of wages, but doesn't cover rent or your return on capital, those sorts of things. And the longer that goes on, in my view, the more it's a different experience and probably more damaging. So I feel Australia is still the lucky country in a lot of ways, and I think we also probably need to give credit to our governments that on world standards have done not without their problems, but a pretty good job. And I think if I was going to if you're going to pick one or the other, you'd take the Australian experience over the UK for sure. So I feel positive in that sense, but I don't want to pretend to have a crystal ball.
I know, it's really, really difficult. Now, look, I just want to say thank you, Tom. This was another phenomenal presentation. It's nothing like having some data to help guide your thinking, but also to keep us focused on not just the look and the feel, but what the data is telling us. It's always amazing to have you working with us, Tom. And I'm sure that everybody wants to give you a virtual clap who's on the session today. Just as Tom said, all of this material we'll be providing on the website, on the TriPeaks website. There were a couple of questions there that we didn't get to answer, and we will get Tom's views on those. He's a bit of an oracle to us now in this space, so we're very lucky to have access to him. And just to say that Tom provides, there is no cost to us or to you for this. We are internally grateful to you, Tom, at a really tough time, to give us your smarts on this subject, and lots and lots of thank yous in the chat for you being with us today. So thank you, Tom. I know it's late there, isn't it?
You're very welcome, Deb. No worries.
There.
I really love what you're doing with the TriPeaks projects. It's my absolute pleasure to be a part of it. So thank you so much.
Take care, everybody, and stay well. Bye-bye for now.